Hero Time, Chapter 8, Broken Helix. The drive to Santa Mira was uneventful, but when they got there, Jen got that feeling like she was being watched again. 3 garages later and they still hadn't located the awesome mobile or Ken. But it was weirder than that. Jen frowned. Why aren't there any people? Gwen frowned at her. What? Jen waved her hand around at surrounding streets. Look around. There's no one here. The whole town is deserted. For a town that could sustain 5 garages, that was no easy feat. Gwen looked around and frowned. Kevin checked his watch. It's nearly 10. Maybe they went home. He didn't even sound like he believed it. Jen shook her head. No, something's going on here. Gwen, you think you can track him, your way? I've been trying. Something's not right, though. It's like I'll get a lock on him and then he vanishes. I need something concrete to get a lock on him. Kevin frowned. Gwen had been able to track Jen the other day without an item of hers, but now she couldn't find her own brother. He didn't want to think about what that might mean for the guy. Jen frowned again and looked around. Then her eyes widened, and she took off down the street. The others followed without question. They found her a block away, standing next to a piece of junk car parked in front of the next garage on their list. There was duct tape holding the front fender together. It was green, or had been at one point. It was nearly brown with all the dust and dirt that coated it. Gwen went pale as Jen circled the car. All 4 tires are blown. I could have fixed those, and I'm not even a mechanic. Kevin frowned. This is the awesome mobile. Gwen nodded as she opened the trunk. Jen grabbed a rolling board from nearby and slid under the car. Kevin frowned. Do you even know what you're doing under there? Jen's leg kicked out at him, just missing. Grandpa Max taught me a few things. There was a ping of metal against metal, then another. Gwen had pulled a suitcase out of the trunk and was digging through it. Jen wheeled back out from under the car. I know for a fact these shouldn't be here. She held up a hand for the others to see. There were small, pointed, star-shaped pieces of metal there. Caltrops. Kevin took one from her and flipped it in his hand. Automated. Jen's expression went dark. Ken didn't break down. This was sabotage. Kevin nodded, motioning Jen off the rolling board so he could get a look under the car. The mechanics made him cringe, held together with duct tape and a prayer. It was a miracle that Ken hadn't just broken down, but he definitely hadn't. The pieces of metal were embedded into the car all across the front. Kevin pulled a few more off, though some were so deeply embedded that even he had problems getting them off. He slid back out of the car. Gwen was sitting cross-legged mid-air, a shirt floating in front of her. Jen turned to Kevin. What do you think? Kevin shook his head. Definitely sabotage. Worse, these are alien tech. Level 3, nothing too fancy. But they'd have caused electrical failure throughout the car, along with the tires blowing. I don't know what your cousin may have gotten into, but it's nothing good. Jen's hands tightened into fists. Gwen's eyes snapped open. Found him! She took off to the car, and Kevin and Jen raced after her. Finding the factory, nearly a mile outside Santa Mira, was easy. It was the only thing inside of the town that had any kind of life. It was lit up, and they could make out figures moving inside, but no one was going in or out. And though the windows were lit, they couldn't make out more than the moving shapes inside. There were guards at the doors, every door. Jen frowned and scanned the area with the binoculars Kevin had handed her. There, she pointed at a long canal full of greenish water. It ran outside the gate. Gwen frowned but nodded. Kevin took the binoculars and stowed them in the car, which was parked behind a ridge. Jen handed him her phone, and Gwen followed suit. The 3 of them made their way silently down the ridge and into the canal. Kevin tore the fence under the water, and they made their way into the facility. It was about then that something grabbed hold of Jen's foot and yanked hard. She kicked out and made contact with something that felt very much like a tentacle. The fight with the thing didn't take long, but she only managed to throw it out of the water, then come up gasping for air. They were surrounded. We are not subtle. Kevin shook water out of his hair as Gwen's hands glowed. But we kick much butt. The fight was quick, over save for one DNAlien in a few moments, but Gwen recognized the face still barely sticking out of the creature. It was Ken. Okay, then let's get this thing off. Kevin said, and began to pull at the alien skin nearly covering Ken. Both beings screamed, and Jen leapt forward, yanking Kevin's hands away. "You're hurting him!" She was about to say more, but the Omnitrix brushed against where Ken and the DNAlien were fused and beaked loudly. Jen jumped. It hadn't done that before. She pulled back, and both Gwen and Kevin looked at her as the Omnitrix glowed bright and spoke in a voice very like Jen's. "Severe genetic damage detected." All three of them stared at the Omnitrix. "Hello?" Jen's voice was hesitant. The watch had never done anything like this before. "Genetic code splicing error. Should we attempt to repair?" Jen blinked. She was ignoring the other two now. The watch had all her attention. She didn't see the flash of hope in Gwen's eyes or the wariness in Kevin's. "Fix Ken?" "Yes." She felt like the watch was telling her what to do, and for once it wasn't being annoying. She laid her hand on the alien part of Ken and couldn't hold back the scream as tentacles wrapped around her arm and up her shoulder to her face. Her vision flashed green and stayed that way. Gwen was about to have a panic attack. Jen wasn't moving, neither was Ken. But that wasn't the freakiest thing. No, when the watch had spoken, asking for permission to fix her brother, Gwen had felt hope seep through the despair at the prospect of having her brother safe. But when Jen had put the hand with the Omnitrix onto the DNAlien that had fused with her brother, it had attacked, wrapping her cousin's arm, shoulder, and part of her face in tentacles. A green light had flashed from the Omnitrix, and lines of circuitry had spread across Jen's skin from the watch out. Now her cousin's eyes were flooded green, the same light within the watch, blotting out all signs of life from the other girl. Gwen held back a sob and felt Kevin's arm wrap around her. Jen could feel everything. She was inside the Omnitrix, surrounded by green light and pure darkness. But she wasn't alone. The thing that had taken her cousin was in here with her, wrapped around her. Then she saw something. It was like there were two sets of DNA helixed around each other, one intruding and breaking the other. She reached out and separated them. As she did, the green light around her repaired the damage to the first, and in a moment she was holding two separate DNA strands. One she recognized as human, Ken's then. The other was unfamiliar. She released Ken's, finished with the repairs, and studied the other strand for a moment. Then she blinked, and the green lights faded. She was standing in the factory in front of her cousin, who was human again, blinking sluggishly. He let out a shaky breath as the last of the DNAlien's skin fell away, and Gwen released him from her powers, rushing to his side. Jen dropped the thing still in her hand. It looked like the head of a DNAlien. Kevin stepped on it for good measure. "You're gonna be okay, Ken." "It's up to you now, Jen. I know you can do it. You just need the right parts. I love you, kiddo." Ken and Kevin had to hold Jen back as she tried to rush forward. She had just gotten Grandpa Max back. She couldn't lose him again now. Kevin held her arm fast in a stone hand, blocking her from using the Omnitrix. Ken had tears spilling down his face as Jen screamed and the lights went off. Gwen just got her shield up in time. Jen stared, unblinking, as the explosion went off. Only when she couldn't stand the light any more did she close her eyes. They were stinging, and she felt tears stream from them. The shield dropped, and Kevin let go of Jen to catch Gwen as she stumbled and fell. Ken was shaking. "Grandpa, he's..." Ken couldn't finish the sentence. Jen caught him as his knees buckled. She pulled him up so he was leaning on her shoulder. Gwen was barely conscious. Jen pushed her own pain aside and focused on her cousins. Between her and Kevin, they got them both back up the ridge to the ex-con's car. Jen carefully set Ken down next to Gwen on the hood of the car. Kevin pulled a few sodas out of the trunk. He gently coaxed Gwen into drinking. She needed to get her strength back. Kevin was shaking, but didn't seem able to speak. Eventually, they made their way into the car, Ken and Gwen in the back seat, leaning against each other. Jen sat in the front, resolutely staring out the window. Kevin reached over to her and tapped her on the knee. She looked at him and frowned. He was holding out another soda. He must have grabbed it earlier. "Drink. You probably need it." She took the soda. "Thought you had a rule about drinking in the car." Kevin shrugged. "Rules were made to be broken." Jen let out a dry, humorless laugh. She chugged the soda in one go, her empty stomach grumbling. But she wasn't hungry. Kevin pulled into the driveway of the garage where the automobile still rested. Jen hopped out of the car and tossed the empty can. Kevin followed. Jen was grabbing Ken's things out of the automobile. Kevin ducked back onto the rolling board and pulled the rest of the caltrops out of the car. He dumped them into a small container in his trunk. It was a mark of just how bad Jen's mental state must be right now that she didn't even comment. She just set Ken's suitcase into the trunk, but she didn't go back to the front seat. Instead, she opened the back door. Gwen was asleep, but Ken looked up at her. "We need to get our story straight." Ken blinked at her, confused, but Kevin nodded. "She's right." Jen sighed and spoke again. "Uncle Frank and Auntie Natalie don't know. Neither do Mom and Dad. They can't know. It's safer for them, and lets Gwen and me do our thing without them worrying." Ken shook his head slightly as he rubbed his temple. "I'm still not sure I understand what's happening. Aliens are real?" Jen nodded. "Yep, that's the summary." She sighed her hand and ran her hands through her short hair. "The actual story is a lot more complicated." She tapped the Omnitrix. "This is what's called the Omnitrix. It lets me turn into a bunch of different aliens. The alien who made it wanted it to be used for science and teaching, but other beings had other plans. I ended up with it by accident. Over the summer, me and Gwen spent with Grandpa." Ken looked a bit overwhelmed. "Is that why you cut your hair?" Jen laughed. "It was involved. Yeah. Grandpa." Her voice sunk in her throat. "He's a member of an intergalactic police force called the Plumbers. Technically, so am I." Ken wrapped an arm around his sleeping sister. "And Gwen?" "Magic." Jen shrugged. "It ain't magic," Kevin said nearly under his breath. Jen rolled her eyes. "Kevin is convinced we have alien heritage, which is why Gwen can do what she can do, but Grandpa never told us about any alien relatives." Kevin frowned. "Did you ever ask?" "Haven't had the chance. Never will now." The thought was like a punch to her gut. But if there was anything Jen had been learning since she was 10, it was to roll with punches. Kevin shook his head. "So these aliens, they're after the Omnitrix?" Jen shook her head at her cousin. "I wish it were that simple. I don't know what they want, or why they're here. We need to work out what we're telling people. We can't exactly tell them the truth, after all. Tell them part of it." Kevin shrugged. The two conscious Tennysons raised eyebrows at him. "Your car broke down in Santa Mira. Gwen got worried when she couldn't get a hold of you. Asked for a lift. I obliged, of course. Jen tagged along. Your phone was busted, which was why no one could get a hold of you. We gave you a lift home. Don't make a lie more complicated than it has to be." Jen gave Kevin an appraising look. "That's pretty clever." Kevin shrugged, but there was a small smirk pulling on his lips. "My phone's not busted. I don't even know where it is." Kevin patted his pockets and came up empty. Kevin shrugged. "Stolen, then." Jen nodded. "Not a bad idea. What about Grandpa? They deserve to know." Jen shrugged at her cousin. "You want to tell your parents, and mine, that their father blew himself up to stop an alien plot to take over the world?" If it weren't for the cracking in her voice, Kevin would have sworn she was trying to make a joke. Ken deflated. "When you put it like that..." Jen reached out and took her cousin's hand. "Gwen and I will figure out how and when to tell them. We've been at this a while." Ken's eyes filled with tears. He pulled Jen into a hug. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. My baby cousin is some kind of superhero and my sister is magical." Jen stiffened and let herself sob into her cousin's shoulder. Kevin made no comment as the youngest Tennyson crawled into the back seat with her cousins. He closed the door behind her and got back into the driver's side. He eased out of the driveway and started the drive back to Bellwood. They were quiet for a while, and Kevin thought they had fallen asleep, but a voice proved him wrong. "How did you fit into all of this? I'm sorry, I don't think I caught your name." Kevin glanced into his rearview mirror. Ken was still awake, though now he had his sister asleep on one side and Jen asleep on the other. The poor kid seemed to have cried herself to sleep. Kevin sighed. "I met them when we were all kids. My name's Kevin Levin. Well, well, let's just say we didn't get along as kids, but I'm turning over a new leaf. I want to do some good in the world, make up for all the bad I've done. Seems like a good way to do it." Ken nodded, and Kevin's focus shifted to the girls. Gwen's sleep looked peaceful, blissfully unaware of her grandfather's fate, or too tired to process it. But Jen was making noises in her sleep, shifting, and there were fresh tears on her face. "So which one do you have a crush on? 'Cause my money's on Gwen." Kevin snorted and refocused on the road. "The bad sense of humor runs in the family." Ken laughed, for the first time since Kevin had met him. He had an arm wrapped around both of the girls leaning against him. He might be making jokes, but he was holding them like they would vanish if he ever let go. Chapter 9. Coded. Noon the next day found Jen sitting at the table in the rust bucket. Gwen was spending the day with Ken and her parents. Everyone was shaken from his disappearance and reappearance. He'd agreed to lie to the adults about what exactly had happened, but Jen had decided that she would be intruding if she stayed. Sure, they were cousins, but sometimes the siblings needed to be alone. And Jen had other things on her mind today. Something Grandpa had said before he'd blown the hatchery had stuck with her. You just need the right parts. She'd been thinking about it ever since she'd woken up at Gwen's house. Ken had carried her inside. Gwen had apparently woken up on the ride back to Bellwood, but Jen had been so tired she'd slept till 10 that morning. Her parents had called her out of school, afraid she was working herself too hard. She'd texted Julie that she was fine and to tell Al the same thing. She needed to find out if the Apollonite had a cell phone. You just need the right part. It was something Grandpa Max had said to her before. She stood from the table and left the RV, heading to the shed. They'd been working on her bike there for a few years, and every time they hit a hitch, Grandpa had smiled and said that they just needed the right parts. Jen began to search the shed. She didn't find what she was looking for until she flopped down next to her bike and threw her hands up in frustration. There was a click as the Omnitrix passed the seat, and a compartment on the seat of the bike opened. She stared. She hadn't known that was there. She reached in and pulled out another holo viewer. She laughed hollowly. Really, Grandpa? But with a shake of her head and trembling hands, she clicked the playback key. Jen, I knew you'd run across this eventually. There's a chance that if you're watching this, I'm not there anymore. Jen felt tears building in her throat. You need to be strong. But you'll need more than just a team. Go to Ed's mechanics. Talk to Ed alone. Show him the Omnitrix. He'll know what to do from there. The message blinked out. Jen stared at the holoviewer. That was it? His last message to her was to go talk to the family mechanic. She almost threw the holoviewer across the shed, but she took a deep breath and tucked it into her pocket instead. She stood and locked up the shed before mounting her normal bike and taking off for the shop. It sat on the edge of town near the RV park. Ed had been a friend of the family for years. He'd helped her and Grandpa put together her motorcycle. She'd pulled up to the shop and dropped her bike at the rack. She frowned at the sight of the automobile, still hooked up to a tow truck. Ed must have sent one of his mechanics to pick it up that morning. She took a deep breath and walked into the shop. There were two customers there, Amy from school and her father. Amy was a year older than Jen and had started driving and apparently totaled her car. Ed waved at Jen and handed the paper over to Steve, one of the other mechanics. Hey, Jen, haven't seen you in here in a while. How's your granddad? Jen couldn't stop the flash of pain that crossed her face. Ed frowned. Something happened, kid? Jen held up her hand, her sleeve sliding back enough that the Omnitrix was visible. We need to talk. Ed was tight-lipped as he led her to the back of the shop, where only the mechanics and the cars were allowed. None of the mechanics commented. He led Jen down a small hallway she'd never noticed. Ed frowned as he turned to her. Your granddad said this day would come. I didn't expect it to happen so soon. Jen nodded again. Ed pulled a wrench out of a cup on the wall, and Jen spotted a key at the base. Something bad happened to him, huh, kid? Jen nodded. How'd it happen? Laser fire? Jen blinked. Null void projector without the focus. He used it as a grenade. Ed hissed. Yeah, that would do it. I'm sorry, kid. I know how close you were. Ed slid the key into the wall and put the wrench back as the wall opened, revealing an elevator. Is there anyone who doesn't know Grandpa Max was a space cop? It hurt to refer to him in the past tense, but Jen needed to know the answer. Ed shrugged. Oh, plenty of people. He worked with my pops when he was still around. I never went in for all that, but the family business sits over the whole. Jen frowned as Ed beckoned her into the elevator. She followed him. It took a while for the elevator to reach the bottom, but when it did, Jen gasped as she spotted what lay beyond the door. It was a large room with walls of seamless green screens, all dark and inactive. There were several computer terminals and equipment she knew to be alien. Ed motioned her out of the elevator. Yours now. I can't work any of it, but I don't have a fancy badge or the Omnitrix. I just make sure only the right people get in here. Latest plumber tech as of the last time your granddad was down here. Must have been about a year ago. Jen nodded and stepped off the elevator into the base for the first time. She took a deep breath and smiled at Ed. There were tears in her eyes, though. Thanks, Ed. I've got work to do. If my cousin Gwen comes by, can you let her down here? She should see this, too. Just her and the boy with her, Kevin. You'll like him. He's a damn good mechanic. Ed nodded and looked contemplative. I could always use another hand around the shop if he's looking for work. Jen nodded. Ed closed up the elevator and it took him back up to the shop. Lights came on as Jen stepped fully into the room. Computer system online. State your name. Jennifer Tennyson. The lights and computers flicked on, and a pleasant green. Welcome, Specialist Tennyson. Jen nodded and sat down at one of the computer consoles. Let's get to work. She cracked her knuckles and began to search through the database. She'd never had an official plumber's training. She had a lot of catching up to do. It was nearly 6 in the evening when Gwen started to get worried. Ken had gone out with their parents, off to see a movie that had nothing to do with aliens. She hadn't heard from Jen all day, since the younger girl had left at around 11. Gwen had some homework to do, but she couldn't focus on it. All she could think about was Grandpa Max. He'd told her he believed in her, told her to be a good girl. She shook as she leaned forward, tears spilling out of her eyes. He was gone. She couldn't feel him anywhere on the planet. At least before, she knew he was alive somewhere. Now, she hiccuped as something pinged against her window. She blinked and stood, scrubbing her face. She stepped over to her window as a second ping sounded. She blinked and opened the window. Kevin was standing on her lawn, a small pile of pebbles in his hand, clearly picked up from the driveway. His car was parked at the end of the lawn. He smiled slightly. Hey, come down. She smiled slightly and stepped out of her window, pink energy steps materializing under her as she stepped down to the lawn. He smiled at her. She tilted her head. Why are you here? He pointed to his car. You and Jen need to let loose after what happened yesterday. We're gonna go find her, and we're gonna have a drink. Gwen frowned, but before she could protest, Kevin raised a hand. You can't argue. We're drinking to your grandpa. Gwen let out a sigh and nodded. She got into the car and focused on her cousin. It was like she could pick out individual people out of a sea of color. But Jen was easy to pick out. Most energy was pink. Gwen had no idea why. It came in a million different shades, but the color was rarely different, except with Jen and the boy she'd been talking to, Albracic. He was violet, but Jen had been green for as long as Gwen had known about her powers. She had no idea why, but she was glad about it. It made her cousin easy to find. Gwen frowned. She's at Ed's. Kevin raised an eyebrow. The mechanic's shop at the edge of town? Kevin drove fast. It didn't make sense for Jen to be at a mechanic's shop. She didn't have a car and couldn't ride her bike legally until December and her 16th birthday. They arrived, and Ed, who lived above the shop, stepped outside and whistled. That is a beautiful car. Kevin grinned. Built it myself. There was a definite note of pride in his voice. Ed nodded and circled the machine. You must be Kevin, then. Jen mentioned you. Said you were a hell of a mechanic. I'm inclined to agree. Ed pulled a card out of his uniform jumpsuit pocket and handed it to Kevin. If you ever in the market for a job, come to me first. Kevin grinned. Gwen smiled lightly, too. We're actually looking for Jen. Have you seen her today, Ed? Ed nodded, looking slightly grim. Yeah, follow me. He led them into the shop, making no comment about the cooler under Kevin's arm. He unlocked the hidden elevator and motioned them on board. They both raised eyebrows at him, but Gwen shrugged and stepped aboard. Kevin followed her, and Ed pulled the elevator shut. It arrived, and Gwen gasped at the sight before them. It was a plumber base. The main console board was so big it probably took up the whole space under Ed's mechanic shop. But there were doorways off the main area. It was also empty, save a familiar green jacket draped over one of the chairs. She stepped off the elevator. State your name. The mechanical voice came out of nowhere and made Gwen jump. Gwendolyn Tennyson? She answered, and the computer beeped lightly. Welcome, Miss Tennyson. Kevin hesitated. A door across the room opened and Jen stuck her head into the room. Hey guys! Kevin, get off the elevator. You should be fine. Kevin shot her a disbelieving look, but did as he was told. State your name. Kevin Levin. He waited for alarms to blare, but the computer simply beeped as it had for Gwen. Welcome, Mr. Levin. Then it fell silent again. Kevin frowned. How come it's not rejecting me? On official plumber record, I'm still supposed to be in the null void. A plumber base shouldn't be welcoming me. Jen stepped all the way into the room. I've been busy. That was all the information she offered as she pulled a towel over her shoulders and ran it through her hair. She was soaked in sweat, a fact Gwen found out the hard way by hugging her cousin. She glanced at the Omnitrix and noted the red glow where there was normally green. It was timed out. What have you been doing down here? And how come we didn't know about this place from the start? Would have been very helpful. Kevin commented as he set down the cooler. I didn't even know. Jen stepped over to her jacket and pulled a hollow viewer out of the pocket, tossing it over to Gwen. Something Grandpa said before he blew the hatchery tipped me off to look for it. Found it in my bike. Gwen nodded as she watched the message. Kevin looked over her shoulder. Why didn't you tell me? Gwen asked as she looked up from the now dark hollow viewer. You needed to be with Ken, and Kevin doesn't have a cell. Kevin nodded. May have to fix that. Jen nodded. That would be helpful, yeah. Did I miss something, though? Why are you guys here? Kevin pointed at the cooler. We're raising a glass. He popped the lid off of it and pulled out a green bottle with an alien label. He also pulled out 3 red solo cups. Jen raised an eyebrow. What even is that? Kevin grinned. Apoplexian whiskey. It's not even illegal, but it is extremely strong stuff. Figured your grandpa would appreciate the sentiment. Jen snorted a laugh, even as her eyes stung slightly. You're not wrong. Kevin poured a small amount into each cup and passed them around, before recorking the bottle. Gwen raised an eyebrow at the tiny amount of liquid in the cups. Trust me, you'll thank me for not pouring more later, and don't chug it. This is a sipping whiskey. Unless you want to pass out on the floor. Jen looked into her cup, as if contemplating if she would rather be unconscious or not. Then she lifted her glass. To Grandpa Max. Gwen raised hers too. To Grandpa. Max Tennyson, one of the most hardcore people I've ever met. Jen grinned at Kevin, and they all drank. Kevin wasn't wrong. Both Gwen and Jen coughed as the liquor burned on the way down. Kevin snorted a laugh into his cup as he took another sip. Water bottle's in the cooler. Gwen dove for the cooler, but Jen caught her breath and took another sip. That is intense. Gwen glared at her cousin as Kevin laughed.